In 1956, after 53 years of operation in Detroit, the Packard Automobile Factory shut down its primary production lines. No televised farewell, no presidential statement, no national ceremony, just the controlled silence of a facility that once covered more than 40 acres, stretched across roughly 3.5 million square feet, and employed over 40,000 workers at its peak. At its height, the complex was among the largest automobile manufacturing facilities in the world, a self-contained industrial city of reinforced concrete and steel. During World War II alone, the same factory produced more than 55,000 Rolls-Royce Merlin aircraft engines under license, engines that powered Allied fighter planes across Europe. In the early 1950s, Packard's annual revenues exceeded $100 million, an extraordinary figure for an independent automaker competing against General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, corporations with far deeper capital reserves and national scale. And yet, by 1958, the final automobile bearing the Packard name rolled off an assembly line. A company founded in 1899 in Warren, Ohio, a brand that had survived the Great Depression, retooled for World War, and once defined American mechanical precision, ceased production without spectacle. To understand how something that vast could disappear, you have to measure its scale. When Packard relocated to Detroit in 1903, it built not just a factory, but a blueprint for 20th century manufacturing. Designed in collaboration with architect Albert Kahn, the Packard plant pioneered large-scale reinforced concrete construction, replacing cramped wooden factory designs with open floors flooded by daylight. Rail spurs ran directly into the complex. Raw steel arrived by freight. Engines, transmissions, and bodies moved across coordinated production spaces that expanded year after year. By the 1920s, the plant had evolved into an industrial organism. Foundries roared. Machine tools cut steel with rhythmic precision. Paint shops coated bodies in lacquer that gleamed under factory lights. At peak operation, thousands of workers entered through its gates in synchronized shifts, the hum of machinery constant from dawn to night. In 1928, Packard produced nearly 55,000 vehicles, a staggering number for a luxury manufacturer. Presidents rode in Packards. Diplomats arrived in Packards. Industrial magnates chose Packard because it symbolized engineering discipline rather than spectacle. The slogan introduced in 1901, "Ask the man who owns one," was less advertisement than assertion. When the Great Depression devastated luxury markets, Packard survived by introducing the 120 in 1935, broadening its customer base without fully surrendering its prestige. When war halted civilian car production in 1941, the Packard's Detroit complex shifted to aircraft engine manufacturing at industrial intensity. Assembly lines ran in extended shifts. Precision gauges measured tolerances within thousandths of an inch. The Merlin engines built inside those concrete walls powered aircraft that helped secure Allied air superiority. By 1945, the Packard plant was more than a factory. It was a national industrial asset. In the early 1950s, with revenues exceeding $100 million annually, Packard stood as one of the most respected independent automakers in America. The plant remained massive. The workforce remained skilled. The brand carried decades of credibility. Compared to smaller regional manufacturers that had already vanished, Packard appeared resilient. And then, quietly, contraction began. In 1956, production shifted away from the historic Detroit complex. The decision was framed as consolidation, a rational response to mounting financial pressure after the merger with Studebaker. But inside the factory, the change did not feel strategic. It felt terminal. Imagine the final weeks. A stamping press that once shook the floor falls silent. Conveyor chains slow, then stop. Tool cabinets are emptied. Equipment is marked for relocation. Offices thin as departments consolidate. Workers clock out knowing their shifts will not return. There was no dramatic final horn blast. No ceremonial last car driven beneath banners. Instead, there were small closures layered over one another. Sections of the plant darkened. Gates that had admitted thousands each morning were locked. The organism that had expanded since 1903 stopped growing, and then stopped moving. 2 years later, in 1958, the final Packard automobile was assembled, not in Detroit, but under Studebaker's facilities in South Bend. The name survived briefly. The birthplace did not. The disappearance was not explosive. It did not arrive with scandal or overnight bankruptcy headlines. It unfolded through incremental decisions, financial strain, capital shortages, scale disadvantages, each one narrowing the company's room to maneuver. Within less than a decade of post-war strength, the Detroit plant that once symbolized permanence stood partially idle. Over the years that followed, windows shattered, roof sections failed, weather penetrated concrete. The factory that had once operated as a city within a city became an exposed skeleton of steel and dust. This was not a marginal manufacturer overwhelmed by inevitability. It was a company established in 1899, expanded in 1903, capable of employing tens of thousands, generating nine-figure revenues, and building engines that powered wartime victory, and yet it closed its primary plant without ceremony. Factories are often described as engines of growth, but they are also living systems. They require capital, adaptation, alignment with markets that rarely stand still. When those alignments weaken, decline does not announce itself dramatically. It accumulates. A delayed investment, a misjudged merger, a cost structure that cannot scale, a brand stretched too thin. By the time the gates close, the decisive moment has already passed. How does a company that powerful miscalculate its own future? If you enjoy deeply researched stories about America's forgotten factories, industrial empires, and the cities they built, consider subscribing. And let me know in the comments which lost factory or industrial giant you'd like us to explore next. Chapter 1. The Engineers Who Built an Empire, 1899 to 1929. In the winter of 1899, James Ward Packard stood beside a stalled automobile on a dark Ohio road. The car, a Winton, had failed him again. The engine sputtered. The machine rattled. Mechanical confidence evaporated into frustration. Packard was not a showman. He was an electrical engineer. He did not curse the future of automobiles. He studied failure. Back in his workshop in Warren, Ohio, he began dismantling the machine piece by piece. Bearings, valves, linkages. He traced tolerances, measured clearances, evaluated material weaknesses. Where others saw the automobile as an unpredictable novelty, Packard saw a solvable system. If the machine was flawed, it could be corrected. That moment did not just spark irritation, it sparked intention. In 1899, James Ward Packard and his brother William founded the Packard Motor Car Company. They did not begin with a marketing strategy. They began with a mechanical standard. From the outset, Packard vehicles were engineered with an almost stubborn precision. Early automobiles across America were fragile experiments. Engines overheated, transmissions jammed, steering mechanisms wobbled at speed. Reliability was uncertain, craftsmanship inconsistent. Packard approached these weaknesses not as growing pains, but as design failures. Components were machined more carefully, materials selected conservatively, engines tuned for smoothness rather than spectacle. The result was immediate reputation. By the early 1900s, Packard automobiles developed a reputation for mechanical integrity. They were quieter, more stable, less prone to breakdown. The owners did not boast about acceleration. They spoke about reliability. In 1901, the company adopted a slogan that would define it for decades: "Ask the man who owns one." It was understated, almost restrained. There were no exaggerated claims, no flamboyant promises. The message implied that experience itself was evidence. The machine did not need dramatic persuasion. Ownership would testify. That philosophy, confidence through engineering, shaped every decision that followed. In 1903, Packard relocated operations to Detroit. The city was emerging as a nexus of industrial infrastructure, rail networks, skilled labor, expanding capital. But what Packard built there was not merely a larger workshop. Working with architect Albert Kahn, Packard constructed one of the earliest large-scale reinforced concrete automotive factories in America. At a time when many industrial buildings relied on timber framing and dim interiors, the Packard plant rose in steel-reinforced concrete, with wide spans and enormous windows that flooded production floors with daylight, sunlight across factory floors, concrete that changed manufacturing. The open layout allowed machines to be arranged logically, workflows to expand horizontally, widening and structural load to support heavier industrial equipment. Kahn's design did more than house production. It redefined it. The architectural blueprint pioneered at Packard would influence factories across Detroit and eventually across the world. Detroit's industrial dominance did not emerge by accident. It was engineered, and Packard helped draft the design. By the late 1900s, Packard vehicles were already reaching international markets. Before 1910, Packards were exported to Britain and France, entering European markets that were themselves cultivating automotive innovation. These exports were not high-volume shipments, but they were symbolic. An American luxury automobile competing abroad on engineering merit. Inside the Detroit plant, a specific culture solidified. Engineers held authority. Design decisions were debated through tolerances and metallurgy rather than sales projections. Precision machining became institutional habit. Assembly was careful, deliberate. While competitors increasingly experimented with flashy claims and attention-grabbing features, Packard refined quietly. This culture reached a defining milestone in 1915 with the introduction of the Packard Twin Six, a V12 engine configuration that placed the company at the pinnacle of American mechanical engineering. The Twin Six was not about brute force, it was about smoothness. Power delivered without vibration, speed without mechanical strain. It represented refinement at a time when most engines still felt raw and experimental. The Twin Six reinforced Packard's status as a manufacturer for presidents, diplomats, and industrial elites. Ownership implied discernment. It implied one valued engineering over novelty. Throughout the 1910s and 1920s, production volumes increased steadily, but never recklessly. Packard resisted the gravitational pull of Henry Ford's radical mass production philosophy. The Model T democratized mobility through standardization and relentless cost control. Packard refused to chase that lane. Instead, it doubled down on precision. This decision cemented both strength and limitation. By the mid-1920s, Packard was producing tens of thousands of vehicles annually, operating within an expanding Detroit complex that symbolized permanence. The reinforced concrete plant grew year by year. Its physical mass mirrored the brand's authority. Packard was not merely profitable, it was respected. Buyers associated the name with durability and mechanical restraint. It became embedded in the upper tier of the American automotive hierarchy. Detroit itself was ascending into global prominence, and Packard stood among the architects of that ascent. But embedded within this disciplined engineering culture was an assumption that excellence alone would secure longevity. As the 1920s progressed, the American economy swelled. Consumer credit expanded. Automobile ownership shifted from elite possession to middle-class aspiration. Production volume across the industry accelerated. Marketing departments grew in influence. Styling evolved into spectacle. Packard's identity remained grounded in mechanical virtue. Where others chased volume, Packard preserved aura. And aura creates distance. Distance reinforces prestige. But distance can also restrict flexibility. The commitment to exclusivity, once strategic, began hardening into structural identity. Engineers retained influence over marketers. Mechanical superiority was prioritized over rapid styling cycles. Expansion occurred cautiously. At the peak of its pre-depression strength, Packard appeared invulnerable, architecturally solid, financially stable, internationally respected. Yet the same discipline that built the empire also narrowed its path. Prestige commands admiration, but prestige can also become a cage. As mass demand broadened and competitors sharpened their efficiency and spectacle, Packard's refusal to compromise became both its signature and its constraint. The empire had been built by engineers who corrected a faulty machine in 1899 and insisted it could be made better. But markets do not reward discipline alone. And as the Roaring Twenties approached their abrupt end, the question grew sharper. If precision created the aura, could that aura survive a world that was beginning to demand scale? Chapter 2, The Golden Machine, 1930 to 1945. By the close of the 1920s, Packard was no longer simply a respected luxury automaker. It was an industrial force, operating at a scale rare for its segment. In 1928, the company produced nearly 55,000 vehicles, a figure extraordinary for a manufacturer positioned at the upper end of the market. These were not stripped-down economy cars. They were meticulously assembled machines emerging from one of the most advanced industrial complexes in America. The Detroit plant continued expanding into the early 1930s. New sections were added. Machine capacity increased. Reinforced concrete structures designed decades earlier proved adaptable enough to support heavier equipment and evolving production lines. The complex functioned with synchronized precision, casting, machining, body assembly, finishing, each department feeding the next in calculated sequence. Then came October 1929. The stock market collapsed. Banks failed. Credit evaporated. The Great Depression moved through American industry with ruthless efficiency. Luxury brands were among the first casualties. Wealth contracted. Demand for high-end automobiles plummeted. For a company built on prestige, the threat was existential. Packard faced a decision that cut directly against its identity. For decades, it had defined itself through exclusivity and engineering superiority. Lowering price points risked diluting the brand's carefully cultivated aura. But survival required volume. In 1935, Packard introduced the 120, a mid-priced model designed to broaden the company's customer base. The move was controversial internally. Some feared that associating the Packard badge with a lower price bracket would weaken its elite standing. Yet the alternative was stagnation. The market response was immediate. In its first full year, the 120 dramatically increased Packard's sales volume, accounting for a substantial majority of total production by the late 1930s. Total annual output surged past pre-depression levels, restoring stability to the Detroit plant. Assembly lines that might have slowed were revitalized. Employment stabilized. Dealer networks regained momentum. Strategic adaptation saved Packard once. The 120 did not erase Packard's luxury lineage. Instead, it created a dual identity, traditional high-end models for established elites, and accessible Packards for an emerging professional class. The plant expanded again during this period, scaling production capacity to meet renewed demand. Through the late 1930s, Packard demonstrated resilience uncommon among luxury manufacturers. It balanced engineering discipline with pragmatic flexibility. It protected its core reputation while cautiously expanding volume. The Detroit complex remained active, purposeful, and symbolically strong. Then global conflict redefined industrial priorities. In 1941, as the United States prepared for entry into World War II, civilian automobile production across the country wound down. Detroit transitioned into what President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Factories that once produced chrome trim and upholstery pivoted toward tanks, aircraft components, and military equipment. Packard's Detroit facility underwent one of the most significant transformations in its history. Under license from Rolls-Royce, Packard began manufacturing the Merlin aircraft engine, a sophisticated V-12 power plant that would become one of the most important engines of the war. The Merlin-powered aircraft such as the P-51 Mustang, enabling high-altitude performance critical to Allied air superiority over Europe. The technical demands were unforgiving, and the Merlin required machining tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Components had to withstand extreme heat, pressure, and sustained high-altitude operation. Inspection protocols intensified. Engine blocks underwent repeated measurement checks. Assembly lines operated in extended shifts to meet government quotas. Between 1941 and 1945, Packard produced more than 55,000 Merlin engines at its Detroit facilities. Production schedules ran around the clock. Thousands of workers operated in coordinated shifts, maintaining output levels that positioned Packard as a vital contributor to Allied victory. The transformation was not symbolic. It was operational at scale. Inside the plant, the rhythm changed. Where luxury sedans had once been assembled for private owners, engines destined for combat aircraft moved down reinforced concrete corridors. Machine tools cut steel continuously. Precision gauges verified clearances repeatedly. Supervisors enforced strict inspection cycles. Mechanical excellence became a military requirement. Government war contracts stabilized revenue streams and expanded capital investment. Equipment upgrades improved machining capacity. Employment swelled as demand intensified. By the end of the war, Packard stood not only as a respected automaker, but as a proven defense manufacturer. Its engineering credibility had been validated globally. The same discipline that had defined its automobiles now powered fighter aircraft in combat. Packard's name became associated with precision under pressure. The Detroit plant operated at industrial intensity unmatched in its earlier decades. Financially, wartime production strengthened the company. Predictable government payments reduced market volatility. Capital expenditures modernized sections of the facility. By 1945, Packard appeared structurally secure. But wartime expansion carried unintended consequences. Civilian automotive design evolution paused. Styling innovation slowed. While Packard focused on military output, competitors, though similarly constrained, quietly planned for post-war modernization. New plant layouts, aggressive styling strategies, and scale-based efficiencies were conceptualized during the war years. For Packard, the war reinforced a core belief that disciplined engineering and manufacturing precision would secure enduring relevance. After all, the company had survived the Depression through strategic adaptation. It had powered Allied aircraft at unprecedented scale. It had expanded its facility and workforce while others faltered. By the war's end, the Detroit plant stood immense and confident. Its reinforced concrete structures housed newly installed equipment. Its workforce was seasoned by military-grade production standards. Its reputation had been strengthened by national contribution. The American consumer market that awaited post-war manufacturers was unprecedented in size and appetite. Returning soldiers sought new cars. Families relocated to expanding suburbs. Highway construction accelerated. Automotive demand surged across the country. Packard entered this new era with prestige intact and production capability proven. Externally, it appeared positioned for continued dominance. Yet beneath wartime success, certain structural realities remained. The plant, though vast, had grown incrementally since 1903 rather than being comprehensively redesigned. Production methods, while precise, were not optimized for the aggressive scale and rapid styling turnover emerging in the broader industry. Wartime profits had stabilized finances, but they had also deferred difficult modernization decisions. When peace returned, the competitive battlefield shifted. Consumers no longer measured cars solely by mechanical refinement. They evaluated design, innovation, convenience, and visual impact. Annual model refreshes began reshaping expectations. Capital intensity escalated dramatically. The war had confirmed Packard's excellence. It had not prepared it for an industry accelerating towards scale and spectacle. As post-war demand surged and competitors modernized aggressively, Packard faced a new test, not of engineering precision, but of strategic speed. The Golden Machine had survived depression and war, but the next challenge would not reward survival alone. Chapter 3: The Post-War Trap, 1946 to 1953. In 1946, as civilian automobile production resumed across the United States, Detroit roared back to life. Dealerships filled with buyers who had waited years for new cars. Factories that had built tanks and aircraft engines pivoted back to chrome, steel, and upholstery. At first, Packard benefited from the surge. Orders poured in. Production schedules filled. Revenues remained strong. The Detroit plant, hardened by wartime output, seemed ready for peacetime dominance. But step inside the factory floor, and the structural gap becomes visible. Unlike newer post-war facilities designed as unified horizontal flow lines, the Packard complex had grown incrementally since 1903. Buildings were added in phases across decades. Departments were connected by corridors and bridges. Materials did not move in clean, linear progression from stamping to assembly. They moved up and down. Steel stampings were hoisted between floors. The engines were transported vertically before being lowered again for final assembly. Parts traveled longer distances than necessary because the plant's architecture reflected early 20th century logic, not post-war efficiency. Now imagine a newer General Motors facility, long, continuous floor lines, fewer vertical transfers, materials entering one end and emerging as finished vehicles at the other. Designed from the ground up for high-volume throughput, Packard's plant was massive. But it was not optimized. Scale alone did not guarantee competitiveness. Labor costs compounded the problem. The post-war era empowered organized labor throughout Detroit. The United Auto Workers negotiated improved wages, pensions, and benefits across the industry. For companies producing millions of vehicles annually, these costs could be absorbed across vast output. Packard, as an independent manufacturer with lower volume, felt the pressure more acutely. By the early 1950s, labor expenses per vehicle were rising faster than production efficiencies improved. Healthcare commitments and pension obligations added long-term liabilities. Without the scale of General Motors or Ford, Packard's fixed costs weighed more heavily on each car it produced. Profit margins tightened. Meanwhile, the consumer market was evolving at speed. One moment in particular illustrates the shift. In a Detroit showroom around 1948, a prospective buyer sits inside a Packard sedan. The craftsmanship is evident. The engine is smooth. The interior was restrained. But across town, another dealership offers something new: Hydramatic automatic transmission, pioneered by General Motors. The buyer no longer wants to shift gears manually in traffic. Convenience is becoming a luxury. Packard introduced its own automatic transmission, the Ultramatic, in 1949. It was reliable and carefully engineered. But it arrived late to a market that had already begun associating automatic convenience with modern sophistication. In perception, being second matters. Dealers began hearing the question, does it have an automatic like Cadillac? Perception shifted incrementally. At the same time, styling became theater. By the early 1950s, Cadillac models showcased bold chrome, sweeping body lines, and the early rise of tail-fin aesthetics that signaled futurism and optimism. Our showrooms glowed with expressive color palettes and sculpted sheet metal that suggested motion even at rest. Packard remained restrained. Clean lines, conservative profiles, mechanical dignity. For longtime customers, this consistency reinforced identity. For younger buyers entering a booming middle class, it felt static. Model year refresh cycles accelerated industry-wide. General Motors treated design as seasonal momentum. Packard treated it as refinement. Inside Packard's executive offices, disagreement intensified. Chairman George Christopher represented one camp, pragmatic, volume-oriented, willing to expand down-market if necessary to maintain competitiveness. Others, including board members aligned with traditional brand prestige, feared that excessive volume and stylistic compromise would erode Packard's elite standing permanently. Two visions collided. One argued for aggressive modernization, redesign the plant, invest heavily in new tooling, and compete directly in styling cycles and chase scale. The other insisted that Packard's strength lay in engineering integrity, that prestige should not be sacrificed for spectacle. Capital was finite. Comprehensive modernization of the Detroit plant would have required enormous investment, reconfiguring multi-level assembly, installing new stamping equipment, redesigning workflow architecture. Estimates for full modernization ran into tens of millions of dollars, capital that an independent manufacturer struggled to secure without risking solvency. Profit margins narrowed further. The success of the 120 in 1935 had once preserved Packard during the Depression, but by the early 1950s, lower-priced Packard models accounted for a growing share of total output. Volume rose. Exclusivity diluted. Dealers faced a brand identity dilemma. Was Packard a prestige mark competing with Cadillac, or a premium mass-market alternative fighting Buick and Oldsmobile? Straddling categories blurred clarity. The Detroit plant continued operating at an impressive physical scale, but operational inefficiencies accumulated quietly. Each vertical material transfer added cost. Each limited production runs constrained economies of scale. Each delayed styling cycle surrendered momentum to competitors. Externally, Packard still projected authority. Internally, pressure mounted. By 1953, warning signals were visible. Sales volumes fluctuated. Competitive pressure intensified. The gap between the Big Three and independent manufacturers widened. Industry consolidation conversations accelerated across Detroit boardrooms. The question shifted from how do we compete to how do we survive, remain independent and attempt expensive modernization, seek capital infusion, or merge to achieve scale quickly. For executives facing rising costs, evolving consumer expectations, and capital-intensive redesign requirements, consolidation offered a tempting solution. A merger could spread fixed costs across greater output. Shared platforms could reduce engineering duplication. Combined dealer networks might strengthen distribution. In 1954, Packard chose that path. It merged with Studebaker. The decision was framed as strategic foresight, the creation of a fourth force capable of challenging the dominant trio of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. But the choice emerged not from strength alone, nor from panic alone. It emerged from pressure, from a plant that was architecturally grand but operationally aging, labor contracts that raised long-term cost obligations, styling trends accelerating beyond conservative cadence, internal debates that consumed clarity. The post-war boom should have been Packard's second golden era. Instead, it became a trap. Because while demand surged and highways filled with new automobiles, the industry itself was transforming into a contest of scale, capital intensity, and annual reinvention. Packard had survived depression. It had scaled for war. It had proven engineering mastery, but post-war competition demanded something different. It demanded speed. And as Packard stepped into merger negotiations in 1954, it did so not from collapse, but from erosion. The merger was meant to secure the future. Instead, it would expose how fragile that future had already become. Chapter 4. The Merger That Broke the Back, 1954 to 1956. When Packard merged with Studebaker in October 1954, the announcement carried the language of ambition. Executives described it as a strategic consolidation, a necessary step toward scale, in an industry increasingly dominated by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. Combined production, shared platforms, expanded dealer reach. On paper, the logic seemed disciplined, but the paper concealed fractures. During merger negotiations, the Studebaker's financial disclosures suggested manageable losses and recoverable inefficiencies. Packard leadership believed cost reductions and integration would stabilize operations. What they did not fully grasp was the depth of Studebaker's structural disadvantage. The revelation came months after integration began. In early 1955, internal financial reviews conducted within the newly formed Studebaker-Packard Corporation revealed that Studebaker's actual production costs per vehicle were significantly higher than previously estimated. In some cases, hundreds of dollars more per unit than competitive benchmarks. Inventory backlogs were heavier. Labor costs in South Bend exceeded optimistic projections. Profit assumptions used to justify the merger unraveled under detailed audit. The numbers did not align with the narrative that had sold the deal. Instead of acquiring scale efficiency, Packard had absorbed a partner with deeper financial strain than disclosed. Integration costs compounded the problem. Consolidating operations, rationalizing supplier contracts, and harmonizing engineering teams required capital the merged company did not possess comfortably. By mid-1955, cash flow tightened. Meetings with lenders grew tense. Banks demanded clearer projections. Credit terms shortened. Collateral requirements increased. Suppliers, sensing instability, pressed for faster payment cycles. Conversations that once revolved around expansion now focused on liquidity. The company's stock price reflected skepticism. Wall Street analysts questioned whether the merger had created strength or merely concentrated weakness. Investor confidence eroded gradually but unmistakably. Inside boardrooms, the tone shifted from optimism to containment. Production targets were revised downward as sales softened. Fixed costs remained stubborn. Annual styling changes demanded fresh tooling investment at precisely the moment capital reserves were thinning. Competing against conglomerates with diversified cash flows proved brutal. Dealer confidence began to falter. In several regions, Packard dealers faced an uncomfortable reality. Customer perception was shifting. Rumors of financial instability circulated in trade publications. Some dealerships quietly reduced inventory exposure. Others diversified into competing brands to hedge risk. A few closed entirely rather than due to weather uncertainty. The Packard badge, once an anchor of showroom authority, required explanation. In Detroit's East Side neighborhoods near the Packard plant, the consequences felt less abstract. Take, for example, a machinist who had worked inside the factory since the war years. Someone who once measured Merlin engine tolerances with pride. By late 1955, overtime hours diminished. Production schedules fluctuated. Supervisors offered fewer reassurances. Conversations on the factory floor shifted from technical precision to job security. When internal cost reports revealed the scale of Studebaker's losses, executives faced an unavoidable choice: consolidate aggressively or risk collapse. The Detroit plant, historic, expansive, but operationally complex, became a focal point. Maintaining parallel production facilities in Detroit and South Bend strained limited capital. Consolidation promised cost savings, but at enormous symbolic and human cost. The Detroit complex had been Packard's institutional heart since 1903. Yet the arithmetic was unforgiving. In early 1956, leadership made the decision to cease automobile production at the Detroit plant and centralize operations in South Bend. Publicly, it was framed as rational efficiency. Privately, it was survival. The announcement did not arrive with a dramatic ceremony. It filtered through departments and stages. Production lines slowed. Equipment inventories were cataloged for transfer. Skilled workers received notice. Thousands were affected. In neighborhoods surrounding East Grand Boulevard, small businesses dependent on factory traffic saw immediate decline. Diners that served early shift workers experienced empty mornings. Hardware stores lost bulk orders. Families recalculated budgets around uncertain employment prospects. For the machinist who had joined Packard during wartime production, the closure meant more than lost wages. It meant the dissolution of identity. The plant had been a career, a craft, a community. On the factory floor, dismantling began. Stamping presses were shut down. Conveyor lines were disassembled. Tool cabinets emptied. The concrete corridors that once echoed with synchronized machinery fell into intermittent silence. The merger had promised scale. Instead, it exposed vulnerability. Due diligence failure was no longer theoretical. Internal 1955 financial analyses had revealed that the combined company's cost structure was unsustainable without drastic reduction. Credit markets had tightened precisely when capital investment was most needed. Dealer shrinkage, while not catastrophic overnight, signaled waning confidence, and consolidation delivered a brutal irony. To preserve the Packard name, executives sacrificed the Packard birthplace. By mid-1956, Detroit automobile production ceased. The plant that had pioneered reinforced concrete manufacturing, that had assembled twin-six engines and wartime Merlins, stood partially idle. Production shifted to South Bend. The brand survived on paper, but the foundation was fractured. Wall Street skepticism hardened. Analysts questioned whether Studebaker Packard could maintain competitive styling cycles without capital. Whose suppliers remained cautious. Dealer networks thinned further as uncertainty persisted. The Detroit closure was not simply a logistical move. It was a scene, to employees, to competitors, to investors, that the merger had failed to produce stability. In the years that followed, historians would describe the merger as miscalculated consolidation, an attempt by two vulnerable independents to outscale forces already beyond their reach. At the time, it felt less analytical. It felt like contraction. The merger had been intended to create a fourth pillar in Detroit's automotive hierarchy. Instead, it dismantled the core of one. The brand still existed, but the factory that had defined its strength since 1903 no longer built cars. And without its heart, survival would depend on momentum it no longer controlled. Chapter 5. The Last Packard, 1956 to 1958. When automobile production left Detroit in 1956, Packard did not collapse publicly. There was no emergency bankruptcy hearing, no headline declaring immediate extinction. Instead, operations were consolidated in South Bend, Indiana, under Studebaker's facilities, a move described as strategic efficiency. But something fundamental had shifted. The Detroit plant had been more than a factory. It was where Packard's identity had been forged, where reinforced concrete floors carried decades of engineering pride. South Bend could assemble vehicles. It could not replicate that lineage. The Packards produced in 1957 and 1958 bore the historic badge, but increasingly relied on Studebaker platforms. Bodies were shared. Chassis architecture overlapped. To loyal customers, the differences were visible. Automotive enthusiasts began using a quiet phrase, rebadged Studebaker. It wasn't entirely fair. Packard engineers still tuned suspensions and refined interiors, but perception had shifted. The car that once stood distinctly apart now seemed adapted rather than originated. In a late 1957 showroom, a dealer explains the new Packard to a prospective buyer. The chrome gleams under fluorescent lights. The sales pitch emphasizes heritage. But the buyer has read industry rumors. He knows the Detroit plant has closed. He has heard analysts question the company's finances. He asks a cautious question. What happens if parts become hard to find? The dealer pauses, just briefly, before reassuring him. Confidence, once automatic, now requires effort. As financial pressures mounted, marketing budgets narrowed. Dealer inventories thinned. Some showrooms quietly shifted attention toward more stable brands. Service departments hesitated to overstock parts for uncertain future demand. A subtle hesitation entered the purchase decision. Packard had once symbolized inevitability. Now it symbolized risk. Inside the South Bend facility, production continued with discipline but without momentum. Employees assembled vehicles under fluorescent lighting in a plant not originally designed to carry the Packard legacy. Output volumes were modest compared to industry leaders. The scale advantage promised by merger had not materialized. Then came 1958. There was no grand announcement declaring the final Packard. No commemorative badge affixed with ceremony. No factory-wide gathering to mark the end of a lineage that began in 1899. Instead, sometime during that production year, the final Packard-badged automobile moved quietly down the assembly line. Imagine the scene. The car advances beneath harsh overhead lights. Check workers perform final inspections, checking panel alignment, verifying trim, tightening fasteners. A small chrome script reading Packard is pressed into place on the hood. Paperwork is completed. A production ledger records a serial number that no one yet knows will be the last. There is no applause. The vehicle rolls forward, engine humming, and exits the line as it would any other day. Outside, it is parked among others awaiting shipment. It is transported to a dealership. It is sold, driven, absorbed into traffic. And with that, a name that once defined American automotive precision ends not with spectacle, but with routine. Production ceases. The Packard nameplate disappears from new car catalogs. Advertising shifts elsewhere. Corporate focus narrows. The ending is administrative rather than dramatic. Employees file paperwork. Managers reassign responsibilities. Dealers clear remaining inventory. Some discount aggressively to move final units. Others quietly remove Packard signage, replacing it with brands perceived as more stable. For Detroit workers who had once entered the East Grand Boulevard gates each morning, the finality had arrived 2 years earlier. But for the broader market, 1958 marks the quiet extinction. There is a particular coldness in such endings. No courtroom drama, no sudden liquidation sale, just diminishing relevance until continuation no longer justifies investment. The last Packards were competent automobiles. They ran smoothly. They carried families along American highways without mechanical embarrassment, but they no longer carried authority. They no longer represented a company certain of its trajectory. In boardrooms, the calculation was simple. Capital must flow towards scalable returns. The Packard brand, constrained by limited volume and rising industry costs, could not justify further reinvention. What vanished was not craftsmanship. What vanished was momentum. For decades, Packard had survived depression. He scaled for war and commanded prestige. But survival alone was no longer enough in an industry defined by annual redesigns, massive tooling budgets, and relentless marketing cycles. Some brands collapsed loudly. Packard did not. It reached a point where the final badge was pressed onto a hood under fluorescent light, recorded in a ledger, and then quietly driven away. No explosion, no farewell speech, just absence. Packard did not burn out. It thinned, receded, and finally slipped from production. And it faded. Chapter 6: Ruins of an Empire, 1960 to present. By the early 1960s, the Packard plant no longer functioned as a unified factory. Sections of the vast complex were sold off, subdivided, or leased to smaller manufacturers and storage operations. For a brief period, fragments of industrial activity lingered inside its reinforced concrete frame. But without a central enterprise, the structure began to deteriorate in stages. Abandonment does not arrive with a single locked gate. It advances building by building. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as Detroit's manufacturing base contracted, more portions of the Packard complex went dark. Maintenance slowed, roof leaks spread, water seeped into structural joints. Steel supports corroded. By the 1990s, large sections stood vacant. Then came the stripping. Scrappers entered the property, removing copper wiring, plumbing, metal fixtures, anything that could be resold. Windows were shattered. Interior walls were broken open for salvage. The plant's electrical systems were gutted. The structure that once represented industrial permanence became exposed to weather and vandalism. Fires followed. Over the years, multiple blazes tore through different sections of the complex, some accidental, others suspected arson. Flames consumed wooden floors and weakened support beams. Each fire accelerated structural decline. In several instances, parts of the roof collapsed after prolonged water damage combined with fire stress. In 2013, a particularly visible partial collapse drew national attention. Sections of upper floors gave way, reinforcing the plant's reputation as one of America's most endangered industrial sites. Safety concerns intensified. Portions of the property were cordoned off. The cost of stabilization grew further out of reach. Ownership attempts came and went. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, redevelopment proposals surfaced, promising transformation. Mixed-use projects, loft conversions, commercial spaces. Investors spoke of revitalization. Architectural renderings imagined restored concrete and glass. Yet the scale proved overwhelming. Environmental remediation alone required significant capital. Asbestos removal, structural reinforcement, utility reconstruction. Each phase carried multi-million-dollar price tags. The sheer footprint, roughly 3.5 million square feet across more than 40 acres, made partial redevelopment complex and total restoration financially daunting. In 2013, Detroit filed for bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. The event crystallized decades of population decline, industrial contraction, and fiscal instability. Though the Packard plant had ceased automobile production in 1956, its decaying silhouette mirrored the city's broader struggle. The factory became an icon. Photographers and filmmakers documented its skeletal corridors, shattered glass, and graffiti-covered walls. International media circulated images of sunlight piercing broken windows across abandoned factory floors. The aesthetic became so widespread it earned a name: ruin porn, the romanticization of industrial decay. For some, the plant symbolized lost prosperity. For others, it represented resilience waiting for renewal. For urban explorers, it became a pilgrimage site, a physical reminder of 20th century industrial ambition. Concrete events punctuated the decline. Sections of the complex were partially demolished in stages during the 2000s and 10s to address safety hazards. Emergency structural removals were conducted after collapses threatened adjacent streets. Each demolition reduced the original footprint incrementally, altering the skyline that had once projected industrial dominance. Attempts at redevelopment continued intermittently. Announcements were made, financing discussed, partial cleanups initiated. yet large portions of the complex remained structurally compromised. The Packard plant's deterioration unfolded visibly over decades, not behind closed corporate filings, but in open view. Roof lines sagged, stairwells crumbled, vegetation forced its way through cracked concrete. What had once been engineered for permanence was exposed to time. Yet the plant's decline cannot be attributed solely to neglect or municipal failure. The broader forces reshaping global manufacturing were immense. Automation steadily reduced the need for vast industrial labor forces. Computer-controlled machining replaced manual precision. Supply chains globalized, dispersing production across continents. Capital flowed toward flexible, scalable facilities rather than monolithic complexes. The Packard plant had been designed for an era that assumed continuous expansion. It embodied early 20th century confidence, reinforced concrete as a declaration of permanence. But the second half of the 20th century rewarded agility. Independent manufacturers lacking deep capital reserves struggled to modernize continuously. Massive multi-level facilities like Packard's were not easily reconfigured into lean, horizontally optimized production systems. Retrofitting would have required investment disproportionate to expected return. What remains today is not simply a ruin, it is an artifact of an industrial philosophy. Packard was not destroyed by incompetence. Its engineers were capable. Its wartime contributions were critical. Its vehicles were respected. What overtook it was acceleration, of styling cycles, of capital intensity, of global competition, of automation. The plant's decay occurred in public, layer by layer. Visitors who walk its perimeter today see exposed beams and fractured floors where assembly lines once operated with disciplined precision. The silence contrasts sharply with archival images of synchronized shifts and flowing production. Industrial empires rarely vanish overnight. They contract, consolidate, and eventually leave behind architecture larger than the economic systems that once sustained them. The Packard plant stands, partially diminished, partially demolished, as a monument to both brilliance and fragility. It reminds us that dominance anchored in one era's logic may not survive the next era's velocity. Factories do not die suddenly. They age in public,